Hi, I'm Christina Herrin, Government Relations Manager of Health Policy at the Heartland Institute, and today I'm here with Peter Pitts, visiting professor at the University of Paris, president of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest, a former member of the United States Senior Executive Service. Peter was FDA's Associate Commissioner for External Relations, serving as Senior Communications and Policy Advisor to the Commissioner. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today, Peter.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear a bit about what your thoughts are on the FDA and just the past year and a half. We've seen a lot of actions coming out of the CDC and FDA and any state and federal governments. Just what your thoughts are on the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and do you think that they could have taken a different approach in any regard?
Well, I'm extremely happy with what the FDA did. I think the FDA could have fallen back on a more traditional approach and held back emergency use authorizations on devices, diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, and they could have had a good scientific rationale for doing that. But they really stepped up to the plate and recognized that they needed to incorporate new types of 21st century regulatory science and the tools and techniques of that science to make therapies and vaccines available as soon as possible. They did, and the effort was rewarded by our really being able to beat down this pandemic and get back to the new normal as quickly as possible. And as you can see, because of the actions the FDA took, that's in my mind clearly one of the reasons that the U.S. economy and society really has bounced back so much faster and more robustly than the rest of the world.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I just think from our perspective at the Heartland Institute, we obviously are supportive of, rolling back any unnecessary regulations and, providing expedited approval to necessary drugs that are safe, of course. But currently, I think we have a research study at Tufts University that says it takes 12 years and $2.9 billion to bring a drug from lab to market. So definitely any way we can shorten that time or that cost to the drug manufacturers beneficial towards patients. So,
well, sure. But, at the end of the day, the FDA process is a very little tiny bit at the end of that $2 billion. There's lots of things that we can do to facilitate the entire process. And I think that what we learned is that when the whole ecosystem works together collaboratively to achieve a common goal, we can accomplish things quicker, more safely, and less expensively.
Yeah, absolutely. And then kind of piggybacking off of that, I want to talk about more recent events and FDA approvals. So there was a recent Alzheimer's drug that Biogen developed and has brought to the market. And there hasn't been one in 20 years, if I'm correct. I think about 20 years, there hasn't been an Alzheimer's drug. And so there's a lot of controversy over this drug and giving it the approval that it was given from the FDA. And I do know that some FDA officials did quit, their formal capacity at the FDA because of this decision. So do you have any thoughts on that or, any opinions regarding the approval process there and what the controversy was about?
Well, sure do. I wish we had 5 hours to discuss all of it. I think the first point to make is that no FDA employees resigned over this. 3 members of the FDA's independent outside advisory committee resigned. They behaved like petulant children because they didn't get their way. We can talk about that. But I think what's really interesting about aducanumab, which is the name of this drug, is that it's really the first drug ever that can stop the progression of Alzheimer's disease in its earliest stages. And that's really spectacular. It was approved through a mechanism called accelerated approval, which was empowered through the original 21st Century Cures Act, which, among other things, told the FDA to use new tools and techniques of regulatory science to look at clinical trial designs, to look at data, and move forward for conditions that really don't have, robust treatments. And clearly, Alzheimer's falls under that category. So the first thing to note is that the FDA has the authority to do what it did. Congress wants the FDA to behave in these fashions, and that the last time, Christina, that most people touched science was in high school. We were dissecting frogs. There were right answers and there were wrong answers. When it comes to complicated questions of biologics and regulatory data analysis, there are enormous gradations of gray. And I think kudos to the FDA for recognizing that it needs to do new things in new ways right now, not tomorrow, but right now, to bring products to the market that we can then examine in the real world through additional clinical trials, post-licensing clinical trials, examination of real-world evidence to give people solid tools to fight these horrible and debilitating diseases. And also from a pharmacoeconomic perspective, if you can slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease, not cure it, not reverse it, but slow down the progression, our country saves billions of dollars in healthcare costs. So all around, this was a gutsy, solid, scientifically based decision. And what the people that are griping about it shows is that, let's face it, the status quo is a harsh mistress. And if we've learned anything from the COVID-19 experience, is that we've got to learn from the past, but accept new ways of doing things and move forward.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. You mentioned a few things there that I think are really important to note on too, is the real world data. Can you explain a little bit more to our listeners who maybe don't understand why FDA is kind of going in this route of, pursuing real world evidence and why that's so important to future cures?
So traditionally, when a pharmaceutical company wants the FDA to review its data, that's data that was collected, generally speaking, for what's called the gold standard, a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. They take a long time, they're hard to recruit for, and they're expensive. What the FDA is now recognizing is that once a drug is on the market, now obviously whenever you take a pill, it's an experiment, 100% of the time, for all of us, whether it's aspirin or an advanced product for Alzheimer's disease. Every time you put something in your body, it's an experiment. And what the FDA now recognizes is that you can capture data from a real world experience, from a non-gold standard double-blind placebo experiment. You can actually look at all the patients that have taken a drug, understand what happened in those circumstances, and learn from that non-randomized real world data. There are tools for validation of that data that move it from data to evidence. And that's not a rhetorical flourish. That's an important differentiation. And again, what the 21st Century Cures Act said, and what the senior thinkers inside FDA really believe philosophically, is that all of this data, whether it's a classic gold standard clinical trial or real world data captured through registries or electronic health records, it's all incredibly valuable in understanding the safety and efficacy of the drug pre-licensing and post-licensing. And when a drug like adzumenucab comes to the market through accelerated approval, the FDA retains the authority if, in the real world, the data doesn't pan out the way it should, to revoke the licensing. So the FDA is going to continue to keep a very close eye on how this product is working in patients in the real world. But you can't hold back progress until you know everything. You never know everything. The precautionary principle says, don't do anything until you know everything.
Right.
And when it comes to saving people's lives, that is not an acceptable proposition.
Right. Yeah, I think it's just so important to note too is the FDA's gold standard, which we all want safe drugs on the market and we all want effective drugs on the market. But how do we get the safest drugs in the shortest amount of time? We don't want to overextend the amount of time a drug's in an approval process, to meet that gold standard mark, which we want, the USA to be the best and to develop the cures. But, sometimes we can shrink those margins, I think. And I think during, the COVID-19 pandemic, it showed that we were able in some capacity to at least bring that drug to market. I know that research on that type of vaccine had been done for years before, but I do think the development was just so expedited compared to a lot of the other rare diseases. We see that just don't have the cures. But I also just want to ask your opinion on what do you think the FDA could do in the future, to expedite approval and continue to use real world data and continue to move in a direction that's, it's very transformative medicine, and move in a direction that, utilizes technology and the advancements that we have with, looking at genomes and all of this, science that's coming out. What's a way that the FDA could expedite approval? Do you have any critiques of the process a way they could continue to move in the right direction on things?
I think the hardest kind of conceptual evolution that the FDA has to recognize is it needs to be both regulator of and colleague with the pharmaceutical industry, academia, and healthcare providers. And the senior leaders of FDA, including the acting commissioner, Dr. Janet Woodcock, have spoken at great length over a long period of time about the value of collaboration, about the value of incorporating new types of tools and techniques. And they believe it. I know them. They really do believe this is important. The problem is that when a drug company submits its data and talks to various therapeutic divisions and reviewers within those divisions, the line staff at the FDA is not quite as excited about doing things in new and different ways.
Right.
So what Dr. Woodcock and others have recognized is that the FDA's line review staff, these are incredibly talented scientists, they need better training on these new methodologies.
Okay.
When companies come in and they talk about new types of science, new types of clinical trial designs, they're way ahead of the people sitting on the FDA's side of the table. So
Sure.
the time is urgent, and it's right now to make sure the FDA staff is better trained and therefore more comfortable in utilizing these new types of tools and techniques. So I think that's job number one.
Great. Well, I would love to see, more, more working together from the private sector to, the public sector. And I think, we have seen that, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of partnership that, made things work in our community. So I think that's, phenomenal. Do you have any other final thoughts for our audience, or anything about expediting the drug approval process or FDA or healthcare in general?
Well, when it comes to learning about the FDA, it's a complicated and sometimes very arcane process. I would recommend that your members, your listeners, your viewers, people seeing this podcast, visit our website, which is cmpi.org. There's a wealth of information about the things that we think are important in terms of advancing the FDA's mission in the 21st century. And I think right now, the most important thing that can happen is for the president to nominate a permanent commissioner. We're half a year plus into the new administration, no nomination. That
Right.
shows things, and you have to kind of parse out what it might mean. But I think it certainly shows that, empowering the FDA for a 21st century mission is not necessarily at the front of the president's agenda. And I think that has to change.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it would show more leadership within the FDA and, what direction, that they're going in general. And then is there any work that you are doing or organizations doing that our listeners could kind of touch base with or check up on?
Oh, thanks for asking. Well, let me plug my new book.
Yeah.
The Value Equation, a journey through the innovation ecosystem in the time of COVID. And
Awesome.
it can be found at, again, cmpi.org or at Amazon if you're an iBook shopper. And really what it talks about is the urgency of embracing innovation, of breaking the status quo. We were able to do it with great success for COVID-19. We can't revert back now to the way things were. We need to learn those lessons and move forward. And the FDA plays a huge role in that discussion.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. And we've seen, a lot of reforms happen within, the time that COVID-19 started. And then there were a lot of regulatory rollbacks. And I think a lot of people in the public are asking, why do we have these regulations in place if they're not necessary during, the greatest pandemic of our lifetime? And I think that those are good questions to ask. So I really appreciate.
The really important things about regulation is that regulations shouldn't be in place to stop things. They should be in place to explain and facilitate the process.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate it. And I will make sure to link your website below and as well as your book. So thank you so much for taking time to talk with me and give us some, information about, FDA and what's going on in the healthcare sector. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.